So, hello guys, welcome to another session being conducted by GK 101 for the benefit of all aspirants who might be watching. I'm Hemang Gupta. I got an All India rank of 5 in Clat 2023 and All India rank 76 in Ailet, and I shall be going to NLS Bangalore in a couple of weeks' time. I think by the time that this video shall be uploaded. So, the reason that we're conducting this session is because as far as most sections of Clat are concerned, like legal is something that is of course it's not exactly a bouncer, but it's something that is to be expected in a law entrance exam. And English and well GK and quant are something that are somewhat analogous to what we've done in our lives previously as well, right? However, critical reasoning is a section that most of us, including myself, are completely unaware of when we step into the world of Clat. It's an entirely new way of going about logical reasoning. Maybe we haven't thought about certain arguments in that level of nuance and depth before. So it's something that can be very easy to be lost in. And, it becomes very tricky to claw your way out of it if you're way too deep in the throes of it, right? However, we are just going to try to sort of simplify this section, give you a beginner's guide to critical reasoning as the title suggests, so that you have a jumping off point in the journey of critical reasoning. And since CLAT 2024 is right around the corner, like there's still a couple of months left, there is sufficient time for you all to, get strong with the basics and move forward. So without further ado, we shall step into the session. So first of all, I would like to spend a little bit of time discussing what critical reasoning actually expects of you, right? Because whenever there is some certain section provided for in an exam, the examiner does expect the aspirants to either behave in a certain way or answer questions in a certain way or form. And CLAT as an exam isn't trying to test whether you already know the law. They're just trying to figure out how well a lawyer you could make, right? It's still based on probabilities. So first of all, again, it's self-evident that they try to test whether you can read effectively and comprehend a particular passage in a limited time frame, and like this is something that remains consistent throughout the paper in general. Then identifying the main positions that have been put forth by the author. So whenever you come across any passage in critical reasoning, you'll often observe there's various arguments that are given within the larger gist that the passage is trying to convey. So it is incumbent upon the person who is reading through the passage to figure out what that main position is and accurately sort through whatever is the fluff, whatever isn't really central to the argument that is being presented, or maybe it's just something that's ancillary. It supports the position or it aids whatever point the author is trying to make, but isn't the central point in itself. So that is another thing that they expect of you. The third point is an accessory to the second point itself. And the fourth point, it directly pertains to what you're doing when you're answering questions. You take whatever part of the passage you're being dealt with, you're dealing with, like whatever argument it might be. Maybe you need to identify an assumption, maybe you need to strengthen it, you need to weaken it. So you're manipulating its components and depending upon the situation that is asked of you, which is the question stem itself, right? So like this is broadly what the section will expect of you. Like, of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. This is a general idea that might help, come up with your own strategies and theories regarding CR. Like, this is a very personal process in that sense. So again, the way that I went about critical reasoning was mainly geared towards two strategies. One, comprehension-based strategies, which remain consistent throughout the exam. So, and these tips might help you when you're prepping for other sections as well. But I found that I had to tweak them a little bit specifically for CR. And the second thing being strategies that are specifically applied only to CR, like they might not find exact parallels in other sections. So first of all, with respect to comprehension, before I proceed any further, so GK 101 also brings for you an amazing mentorship program wherein you guys shall have the option to be mentored by people from the top 3 NLUs, including myself, a lot of my other friends who have gotten into top 3 NLUs, and you will receive absolute personal guidance for both CLAT and Ailet by us. So some great perks that are associated with this program. So first of all, personal mentorship, and this implies that each and every mentor will only have a specific number of students, only 15 students, no more, so that the personalized quality of service is maintained and no particular mentor is swamped with work, because if they are, it might negatively hamper the quality of the advice that you're getting, or a lot of things might be lost in that sort of rush of trying to get through a lot of doubts. So it'll only cater to a limited number of students per mentor. You will have one-on-one Zoom sessions with us as and when the plan works out. Then doubt clearing sessions, and that goes without saying. And we will also be answering any doubts that you have over chat or voice note. Daily schedules so that you don't go off track. You have a way to coordinate your preparation. You're not just doing things for the sake of it. and access to compendiums with respect to Clat, Ailet, and legal each and every month. You will also have daily GK quizzes, and how important practice can be even for a section like GK, right? Because ultimately you're supposed to be answering questions in the exam. You're not supposed to be mugging up information per se. That is not what the exam is testing, right? So that might help you in that aspect as well. Then Anmol Sai, a senior of mine, he should also be helping you guys out by publishing his own monthly current affairs revision classes and magazine. And other than the primary thrust of whatever we are offering, which is our GK related resources, we also have sectional tests for both critical reasoning and English. Then, again, I think that is already available on the Telegram channel, but this will also be offered in our particular program. You'll have access to the marked newspaper on the Telegram channel every day. And we sincerely believe if you consistently follow through with whatever advice that we try to give you, your mock scores and the general quality of your preparation is likely to increase. Then again, one another thing, if you personally want me to be your mentor, use the code HM30. I repeat, HM30 when you enroll. And you can contact numbers that have been mentioned on the screen if you want to enroll. I'll pause here for a second so that you can see the numbers, and then we should proceed. Right. So coming back to comprehension-based strategies, right? And again, remember, these strategies aren't strictly restricted to CR. They might help you out in other sections as well. So first of all, effective reading and wide reading. Now, you could source these things in a couple of different manners, right? The easiest possible option or the most accessible option to you guys is the newspaper, right? You're getting your GK based information from all the other sections, but when you come to the editorials, you know that you're primarily reading them. So that you have something that's somewhat challenging to read. It's something that's somewhat dense, and you do have to spend quite a bit of time in trying to understand, or at least quite a bit of mental effort in trying to understand what is actually going on in whatever passage has been presented to you. So that is what I mean by wide reading. And again, you don't have to restrict yourself to the newspaper over here. If there's any other source that suits your fancy, maybe it's a site like Aeon, or maybe a blog like ACX, like any source possible that helps you read in a very wide and eclectic manner, go for it. But again, newspapers are often an underutilized resource, and they're very easily accessible because most people, as a part of their Clat preparation, are already going through them, right? And by effective reading, this was the first part catered to wide reading, the second part now effective reading. It basically means that whenever you're reading a particular passage, you're actively trying to keep track of whatever is going on over there. Because a lot of times it tends to happen, right? We're reading something, and after reading like 4 or 5 lines, or even sometimes going halfway through the passage, we realize that we've actually not understood anything that was going on. We've just skimmed through the words, and then we have to go back to the start and start reading the process of reading all over again, right? So that is what I mean by reading effectively. Now, there's a couple of strategies that I shall now suggest in order to deal with that. But effectively, basically just means that you're actively thinking about the gist of the passage, and you're trying to understand whatever the passage is conveying, and not just going through the words per se. Reading actively is again an extension of the previous point. If you're reading actively, you will find that you're also reading effectively in a sense. So here, what sometimes really helped me out was trying to hype myself up for the passage a little bit, even if it's something that I am not particularly fond of. For instance, I did not really enjoy reading economics-based passages whenever I even went through the exam, or saw my mock or went through my mocks. So what I used to do was I used to hype myself up for whatever passage was coming up in the first place, so that I'm interested in reading it, and I'm not thinking right off the bat that, oh, this is something that I don't like, and therefore I will maybe do a shoddy job at reading through it and attempting it. So reading actively, that is what I mean by it. You are engaged in the process of going through the passage. Now, the third point, again, it's sort of related to something that I had already talked about. That is, you need to identify whatever relevant point is being talked in the passage, is being talked about in the passage. So it's understandable that not everything that you're reading in the passage should help you out with answering the questions that you're supposed to write. And moreover, since the passage will often have one main overarching position, and all the other arguments sort of supplementing it, you need to identify which one is the main position, because if you're not able to do that, you might end up picking the wrong option and say a question that as a blanket statement asks you to say strengthen the main argument of the author, or weaken the main argument of the author, or just simply tells you to identify what is the main position that was presented in the passage, the main idea, those sorts of questions, right? So if you don't do that effectively, you're going to suffer in the answering part, right? So again, it becomes all the more important to sort through the fluff, so to speak. Then again, identifying premises, intermediate conclusions, and conclusions. So I'm pretty sure that most of you are already familiar with the idea of premises and conclusions, but just to run you guys through it once again. So a premise is something that the argument relies upon in order to formulate a position, right? And a conclusion is any position that is formulated on the basis of those facts. And these two aspects in conjunction form one given argument. An argument isn't simply a conclusion. An argument isn't simply a premise. It's a combination of both of these aspects, right? And an intermediate conclusion could be an intermediary position that helps in reaching some final conclusion. So let's say one possible iteration of this could be, I read the newspaper, therefore I shall do well in Clat. Now over here, I could add an intermediary conclusion, so to speak, or I think in a more stricter sense, it would be an assumption. But if I had to add an intermediary conclusion, I read the newspaper a lot, therefore I can comprehend well. As I can comprehend well, therefore I shall do well in Clat. Now, one could argue that there's lots of assumptions that are attached in these particular arguments, but over here, the broader point that I'm trying to convey is that there can be certain conclusions that act as both premises in their own right and conclusions for some preceding premise. So identifying such aspects of a passage is also very important if you want to figure out the structure of the passage as a whole. If you misinterpret any of these aspects, there is no doubt that you'll get a question or two wrong with respect to the questions that are being asked. Then the next point, identifying aspects that must be honed on in the light of a given question. So, and this is again a pretty self-explanatory point in a sense, but let's just say that a question asks you to strengthen a particular argument, right? Now, since a strengthening question can concern any component of the argument, they could either work by strengthening one particular premise, or they could work by strengthening one particular assumption, or even the conclusion directly. They will still act upon any particular component of the passage, right? Now, if you don't identify the component that is supposed to specifically hone in on, it might be trickier for you to discussion. This is one way of interpreting what I've said over here, identifying aspects that must be honed in on. The second thing is whenever, and I think this is something that has been sort of more present in the Clat that we gave and in our sample papers, where the question itself referenced a very specific part of the passage, and then we had to cater to whatever was going on in that particular part of the passage, right? So if you're able to figure out which parts of the passage are more important as compared to other parts, and especially in the light of a given question, in the context of a given question, you will probably be better poised in answering the questions that you have to write. Now, paraphrasing and reframing in your own words. I think this is one of the most important points that I can or I will talk about in today's session. The reason being that this is a strategy I implemented very late in my preparation, but I could see how quickly it was able to help me out in the process of prep. So what I used to do was that whenever I had read through 3 or 4 lines or maybe one paragraph, I would just try to summarize it in my own words and try to ensure that whatever my summarization is, it is consistent with the spirit of whatever particular part of the passage that was. One way to practice this outside of your mocks is whenever you're going through your editorials, and editorials are also fairly large. They have a lot of sub passages that form intermediary positions which point towards the final conclusion. So you can go about replacing each and every one of those passages only in your head with a full line, and try to see if that line is concurrent with whatever that particular paragraph is talking about. Then you can look at all of those lines as a whole and figure out if those lines ultimately point to whatever the passage was talking about in the first place. Another fun way to deal with this is that after you're done with reading the passage, try to tell yourself what the main idea of the passage was. Then uske baad, you'll always see that in any particular editorial, especially in the Hindu, there's this one line, there's this one place in the middle of the editorial itself where they've sort of given the main idea, like the main summarization of whatever the editorial was talking about. You can check your own summarization of the passage against whatever they have provided. So that can also be a useful check for figuring out whether or not you're on the right track. Of course, this isn't something that is 100% accurate, but this can still be a helpful starting point in figuring out whether or not you are on the right track. So paraphrasing and reframing, like that is basically that whatever there is to it. Then finally, asking the why. So this also helps a lot in trying to ensure that you're reading actively, because whenever you're asking yourself questions about the passage as you go on, you are engaging with the passage. So ultimately, that it's much less likely for your attention to waver, either through your own will or either in our attention. So now that we're done with comprehension related advice, we'll delve into critical reasoning specific advice. So again, I'll just reiterate it again that whatever advice I had talked about up until now, you could also apply it to other reading sections subject to certain corrections and modifications which are unique to each and every section, right? So just keep that in mind, but broadly they can also work for the other sections as well. So now when we come to critical reasoning specific advice, the first thing that you need to understand is the structure or anatomy of a question, right? So in critical reasoning, every question that you will face will be of the following structures. So first of all, you'll have a stimulus, which in the case of Clat is the passage itself. Like in the case of the US LSAT, I'm not familiar with the pattern of the Indian LSAT. It's just a small 3-4 line statement, right? But in critical reasoning that we have for Clat, there's an entire passage that we have to go through to answer the questions, right? So that's the stimulus that you've been given. Then the question stem is whatever question is being asked from you. And of course, the third part is the options that you're dealing with. So first of all, you need to understand everything that is going on in these aspects, and what each aspect sort of expects from you and how you have to deal with it. So again, like this session is geared for someone who has no idea about how critical reasoning is working. This is also for absolute beginners. So I think it was important for me to address this aspect as well. So now the second point, and I think this is arguably one of the most important points, is accurately identifying what the question stem is trying to say. So the reason that I say this is that sometimes there can be very minutely misleading question stems that wherein two different question types sound very similar to one another, but they're actually very, very different in principle. And like even if you think about them for 1 second, and we usually don't have such a luxury either in our mocks or in the actual exam itself to properly try to pass through every little thing that is being thrown at us. We need to familiarize ourselves properly with whatever a question stem is actually trying to convey in advance. Right? Of course, you will have to think in the exam itself. They're not going to give you quote unquote laddu questions, but you still need to figure out what the question stem is actually trying to say. Right? So I'll try to explain this with the help of an example. So one particular question stem could, for instance, say which of the following statements would allow for the author's argument to be more easily inferred. Right. So it is a statement that would make whatever position the author is trying to convey more tenable. The second thing is, the second type of question that you could encounter is a question that just explicitly asks you to strengthen one particular argument in the passage or the passage as a whole. So now these two question types, although there's a very subtle shift in the way that they're framed, they're still, I wouldn't say drastically different, but they're still different in the way that you need to approach the question, right? So you need to figure out what the question stem is actually saying and just take a moment to ask yourself, is whatever I think of this question the same as what the question wants me to think of it? Another facet of the same point is that, again, in Clat 2023, there were many questions that were very specific and explicitly related to one particular line or part of the passage. And I think this was a mistake that a lot of us did in the sample papers as well. We were so acquainted to the way that mocks were being drafted for us, wherein we were just told to in a blanket manner, either strengthen the passage, weaken the passage, or do any number of things, where we would very conveniently forget to see that there is an addendum right at the end of which of the following would strengthen which of the following lines would strengthen the position, and so on and so forth, right? So you need to properly read through the question statement. Don't rush through it, so that you know what specific part is being dealt with, if any. And if I remember correctly, almost all critical reasoning questions in our paper referenced one particular line or the other in the passage. This made it easier in the sense wherein we did not have to spend a lot of time in thinking about if a particular point would form the main part of the passage, or maybe just an ancillary point. But at the same time, it also made it more tricky in the sense that we did not have the luxury to take it as a blanket statement and go ahead with that. So you need to accurately figure out whatever the question stem is saying, and don't be afraid to spend, maybe another extra 3-4 seconds, just absolutely ensuring that you have it down pat, whatever the question statement is actually saying. So now, progressing on to the third point, identifying the conclusion and the assumptions of the passage, right? So I have talked about it earlier as well, and I will reference it again, that a premise is anything that the author is relying upon in order to formulate the form in arguments, form an argument, right? Now, one of the problems that I faced a lot while going through CR was just trying to figure out what a conclusion was in the first place. Like not as per its theory, but as per its practical application in mocks and all. And the reason for that is that a lot of times there's certain statements that are disguised as conclusions don't exactly function as such. And either they could be statements that are just background information, they don't really have a huge amount of leverage over the overall position, or maybe those are just premises that the author is using to draw upon a conclusion, right? So you need to figure out accurately which of the statements functions as a conclusion and which of these statements functions as an assumption. And again, the reason for that is if you don't figure that out, you'll get your questions wrong, but that's an oft-repeated sentiment as a whole. Now, like just as an example for us for the confusion thing, let's say the author is relying upon someone else's belief or someone else's argument in order to further a position that they themselves have posited in the passage, right? If you're not careful, because both of those statements might sound like opinions, you might end up taking the wrong opinion as being the conclusion and, replace it for another one and, just run around in circles trying to figure out why doesn't this make sense when it actually should be, because maybe you read that a conclusion is an opinion and a premise is a fact. And while those statements might be true, that the nature of that fact might change from one situation to the other, right? And therefore it just becomes important to like figure out whatever positions the author is using in order to figure out whatever conclusion that they want to draw. And yahan par another thing that becomes all the more important is trying to balance different perspectives that are being presented in the passage against one another. Let's say, for instance, you have a passage that's bouncing one back and forth between two positions and maybe doesn't even come to a conclusion at the end. So herein it might be more difficult for you to figure an overall position or an. So it is also very important for you to inculcate the skill of balancing perspectives that have been presented in the argument. And I think the example that I had presented earlier with respect to this point is also germane to CR specific advice. Then finally, then the fourth point, and again, this is something that the consortium also explicitly states, that we don't expect you to come into the exam knowing things earlier. I think that, of course, that assumption goes out of the window with respect to GK and quant, but for the reading sections, it's just your aptitude that matters. Knowledge is immaterial, right? So whenever you're being dealt with any passage, and even if it's a passage that you are entirely unfamiliar with respect to maybe its vocab, although like maybe, not vocab exactly, perhaps vocab or perhaps the subject matter, you don't necessarily have to fret, because the consortium does not expect you to know everything, right? They just want you to accurately manipulate arguments. That is all that they ask of you in CR. So whatever thing you think you know about a particular subject, even if it's something that, you've spent your life studying, if you're attempting Clat, forget all of it and strictly restrict yourself to whatever the passage is talking about. The confines of the passage are the ones that you are supposed to, you're supposed to deal with everything that you have to within those confines. You can't venture out of those. So, strictly restrict yourself to those. And I think that this is pretty much that there is to this particular part. And right. So the thing that I wanted to add over here was that in Clat 2023, one of the passages, if I remember correctly, was some economics passage that talked about the decline of the period. And I think I already mentioned that I did not enjoy reading economics-based passages. So when I encountered this passage, I just, sort of took a moment to recoup, and I decided to figure out that what I need to do in this particular instance is just take the words which confusing at their face value and not think too much about them and not think what they actually mean. Just think about their function in terms of the arguments that are being presented, right? And ultimately, this sort of served me well, because when I went to the questions, I wasn't already panicking, one, about not being familiar enough with the subject matter, and B, I was actually able to focus I had to focus on. So it helped me have a clearer perspective of the questions that I was supposed to answer, and I did not get lost in the fluff of trying to parse through the particular meanings of the words that I had to deal with, right? I'll just briefly go over some of the question types that you will encounter in Clat. Again, by no means is this an exhaustive list, but these are some of the general question types that you might encounter. So first of all, strengthening and weakening questions. यहाँ पर you should be expected to either supplement or take away from any position that's been presented in the passage. Now remember, this could work in any way. Either this could be by, strengthening or weakening one particular premise. This could be by working upon some assumption that is not explicitly stated, like an assumption by definition is something that is not stated, or maybe it just attacks or supplements the conclusion directly, right? Now, over here, what's important to know is that it does not mean that you have to strengthen or weaken the conclusion beyond any possible degree of doubt. As long as it even hampers or aids any position in a very marginal manner, it is still strengthening or weakening. Of course, if a question is which of these statements strengthens the most, you might have to weigh one option against the other as for that aspect. But for the most part, strengthening and weakening assumptions, or weakening questions work in this manner. Then assumptions is, again, it's fairly straightforward. You need to ask yourself what statement, if not true, or whatever, which statement is absolutely required for this argument to function, but it is still not mentioned, right? Now, one very helpful trick whenever I solve assumption questions is something that's called the assumption negation technique. Whenever you see an assumption type question, what I used to do was I used to go through these options and turn every option into its negative. If it's an assumption that is required for the passage to function, when I convert it into its negative, the passage should stop making sense. If the passage still makes sense after I have, converted the statement into its negative, that means that it is not an assumption that is important to the passage, or maybe it isn't even relevant at all. So one of the questions would be identify the assumption, then identifying premises, and over here again you need to ask yourself the question, which of these statements is sort of the one that the author is relying upon to draw upon their position. Now, a very helpful trick, this isn't a trick per se, but something that just helped me, clarify my thought process while I was attempting questions, was that I would always try to put statements in a because, therefore format. So because XYZ, therefore ABC, wherein XYZ and ABC are just placeholders for any statement that you might encounter. If it made sense to me when I put these statements in this order, I would think that, okay, I'm on the right track. If it started sounding a little bit perverse, or, if it started sounding absurd, I would know that maybe I am messing something up and I need to, maybe reframe the way that I'm thinking about it, or, just read the past once again, like do any number of things in order to gain a greater degree of clarity of what I was doing. So identifying premise and conclusions, questions may, you can go with this sort of thing. Then most likely to agree with, least likely to agree with. Over here, you just have to figure out what the main idea of the passage is, about what the author is trying to say, and then analyze different options as per that. If any option is consistent with whatever the author's main position is, so that is something that the author is most likely to agree with. If it isn't something that they're likely to agree with, right? Main idea questions, pretty self-explanatory. You have to figure the main idea and answer the question that is on the basis of that. And over here, doing that paraphrasing thing might help you guys a lot while you're doing your practice. Then cause and effect questions, it is possible that in any given question, you presented with some sort of an event or, some sort of an explanation, and the question statement might deal with an alternate or hypothetical situation based on whatever was based in the passage. And they might ask you if this particular variable in this situation was altered or manipulated with in a certain manner, what is one possible outcome or outcomes. So that could be an example of a cause and effect situation. And course of action, again, there might be one particular situation presented in the passage, maybe it's a problem, and you might be asked to figure out the most optimal solution of said problem, again on the basis of whatever has been dealt with in the passage. I will try to hammer this point down as much as I can. Strictly restrict to yourself to whatever the passage is talking about. Do not go beyond that. Finally, I will just deal with some overarching preparation strategies with respect to CR. These are things that to just help you out in general. And I couldn't really find another category for them to put. So first of all, the effort when the effort required for CR is concerned. For me personally, and I think for a lot of aspirants, CR is one section that will require a considerable amount of effort and a considerable amount of effort in order to be better at. And for me, it was personally one of the most time-intensive sections after GK. Of course, like GK always takes up a huge chunk of your time. So CR was the one that took the most for me. So it will probably merit the most amount of effort and will require you to, question or chip away some veiled assumptions or some veiled issues in your own cognition, which is why it can also get very taxing. But I promise you, if you persevere with it enough, it will probably become one of the most interesting things to do. Like half of the reason that I was more passionate about law during the process of Clat preparation was because I constantly thought if law is anything similar to whatever we're doing in CR, as in like analyzing arguments, trying to, absolutely rip them apart, trying to reverse engineer what was going on in them, then this is a field that I see myself, being interested in. So just we need to persevere with it for as long as you need to, and I promise that it will be rewarding. Then the second thing, diligence and perseverance. I have briefly touched upon perseverance already, but when I talk about diligence, I just basically try to say the amount of curiosity and how meticulous you need to be in order to approach CR, right? So whenever there's any explanation that you come across that doesn't sit right with you, or even if you've come up with an explanation yourself for a question that you got wrong, or maybe it's just a question that you want some greater degree of clarity in, till the time you're not absolutely 100% clear with it, do not move forward. Don't care about the time that you're taking for that particular explanation or justification that might unlock some key insight for you that is going to help you out in other CR questions that you solve. And even if you don't find a one-to-one parallel of whatever situation you were stuck up in and spent an extended amount of time in trying to understand, you can at least be secure in the realization that you have covered this as a base, that you can be confident in that amount or in that aspect of your preparation. So if there's any residual doubt left in any manner, you shouldn't shun it, and you shouldn't just walk away without looking at it. Be thorough with whatever you're doing. Be curious as to the nature and the reason for your mistake, and try to ask yourself in what manner can you improve upon it, or what can you avoid doing in order to fall into such a pitfall again. Then third part being analysis and explanations. So over here, I just want to say that a large part of your CR preparation, it should lie outside the confines of solving questions. At least that was the case for me. Again, over here, I don't mean to say that I poured over theory incessantly. What I do mean to say is that a large part of my preparation was analyzing the questions that I got wrong and ensuring that I don't get them wrong again. Because you see, whenever you're solving questions, one question is going to take at max, let's say 1 minute or 1 minute 30 seconds at max. Explanations and justifications and analyses take a lot longer than that. Like for a question that was particularly tricky, sometimes just trying to understand what went on could take me upwards of 5 to 6 minutes, right? So you can see that there's a clear disparity in terms of the time that you have to invest. So explanations and analysis will often take up a larger portion of your CR preparation, and that is okay. That is something that you don't need to fret about. If it's happening, it's something that's desired. It isn't something that is an unwanted outcome. It is absolutely okay. You should go ahead with it. Then practicing versus theory. When I talk about analyzing a particular question, I also put it under the ambit of practice, right? Now, with theory, I mean pouring over CR theory, going over a lot of lectures, a lot of explanation videos about what a particular aspect of CR is. What you need to understand is that Clat CR isn't as intensive as, say, LSAT or GMAT, right? If you have a fair bit of common sense, you can still comfortably navigate your way around it. Therefore, a lot of theory reading isn't particularly warranted. Yes, you might still have to do some basic amount of it just to know whatever question type you're dealing with, but it isn't something that should be a mainstay of your preparation. It should still be primarily geared towards practice and with theory, right? Now, the fifth point, it is something that is sort of an eternal question in the minds of most aspirants, including my own. Should I read the passage first, or should I go ahead with the question? And I think I've said this before as well. I'll say it again. It always depends upon the context of the passage and situation and the question that you have at hand. So you'll often observe that there's a balance that is often tried to be maintained by examiners when they draft any particular passage and questions. If the passage is inordinately difficult, the questions tend to be a bit easier. If the questions are easier, the passage tends to be, if the questions are more difficult, the passage tends to be a little bit more easy, or there's a general balance that is maintained between the two. Now, if you find any particular passage to be particularly irritating, right, you might want to jump to the questions first, just so you know what you're looking for in the first place, so you don't have to spend a lot of time with a tricky passage. You can just straight away jump into whatever parts you're supposed to focus on and answer questions on the basis of that. If questions are very tricky, it might serve you well to spend a little bit of time with the passage, so that you are able to accurately identify whatever position is being dealt with and answer questions on the basis of that. Since they're trickier, they might warrant an extra degree of comprehension. And finally, this is something that I think almost everyone prepping for CLAT will, swear by: elimination. it is one of the most tried and tested techniques with respect to any section and all, and more so with CR. Instead of trying to look out or scout out for the right option from the get-go, it is much more helpful to cross out the ones that you see as being implausible and then only focus on the ones that you see as being credible contenders as the right option. First of all, it'll clear up your own thinking. You won't necessarily waste time in dilly-dallying between more than two options. I think the battle ultimately only remains between two options in CR. And you won't accidentally end up choosing the wrong option. Like of course, like this is still a worry that could happen. Maybe you could mess up your OMR, but at least when you're copying things down in your head from the question paper, you won't accidentally end up looking at the wrong option and thinking of it as the right one. So elimination is a technique that I will swear by, almost everyone will swear by. And while it might sound a little bit counterintuitive, in the long run, it ends up saving a lot more time than just looking out for the right answer does. So just as a very, very quick rundown of the session, once again, we discussed comprehension and CR specific strategies, and I discussed various facets with respect to those. And finally, I just briefly went over some preparation do's and don'ts that you might want to keep in mind while you're going about your preparation for CR. And that is all that we have for the session today. Once again, if you guys want to register for mentorship programs offered by GK 101, the numbers that you have to contact have been mentioned in the video again. You might want to check those out. And if you want me to be your mentor for your Clat and Ailet journey for 2024, use the code HM30 while enrolling. That's all that we have today for today, folks. And I wish you well for your preparation. All the best, and I hope you have a good day.